Hello, bros. We're back with Alraune by Heinz Ewers, a 1929 translation of the book. I believe it's the only English translation. I could be wrong. Translated by S. Guy Endore and illustrated by Malon Blaine. We are on chapter 6, I believe. Yes, chapter 6. Look into my eyes. Chapter 6, which deals with various incidents of Alraune's childhood. The acquisition of the dice box is mentioned by the Privy Councillor in the leather-bound volume, now no longer kept in Dr. Peterson's clear and sturdy hand. Instead, the details of this little episode must be deciphered from 10 Brinken's own thin and scarcely legible scrawl. A few shorter entries occur previous to the dicebox story, and some of these may be of interest here. Pardon, I almost bit my tongue there. The first one refers to the operation to remedy the child's atresia vaginalis. This Dr. Peterson undertook, and to it must be ascribed his untimely end. We find recorded that the counselor, taking into consideration the money he had saved by the mother's death and the excellent services rendered throughout the whole affair by Dr. Peterson, had felt impelled to promise his medical assistant a 3 months' leave of absence with all expenses paid for a summer trip, and in addition a handsome bonus of 1,000 marks. Dr. Peterson had been highly elated over the prospects of a voyage that would be by far the biggest he had ever undertaken, but he insisted upon first performing this rather simple operation, despite the fact that it might very readily have been postponed for some time. Thus it happened that a few days before his scheduled departure, Dr. Peterson operated, and successfully as far as the child was concerned, but as far as for himself, and this is surprising in view of the exaggerated care he always took, he unfortunately developed a severe case of blood poisoning and expired after 48 hours of the most intense suffering. It had not been possible to determine the direct cause of the septicemia. It was thought to have arisen from an almost invisible scratch upon the doctor's left forearm, very likely inflicted there by the little patient herself. In concluding this entry, the professor remarks that already twice in connection with this affair, death had saved him from expenditure of considerable money. No further commentary was added to the above brief statement. Following that, the report speaks of the unusually quiet and delicate nature of the baby, who, for the present, remained in the clinic under the care of the head nurse. Only once again did she cry, and that was upon the occasion of her holy baptism, which was performed at the cathedral by Chaplain Ignaz Schroeder. What do you got, bruv? Then she did howl, and in the most horrible way, too, so that no one in the small company, consisting of the nurse who carried the infant, the Duchess Wolkonski, and King's Counsel Sebastian Gontram, who were to be the baby's godparents, and finally the pastor, the sexton, and of course the professor, knew what to do with her. No sooner had they left the hospital than she began to yell, and she never ceased for a single moment until she was safely back home again. In the cathedral, the noise was so unbearable that the ecclesiastics hastened through the ceremony with all possible speed in order to spare themselves and those present from any more of this ghastly cantata that was absolutely necessary. Everyone sighed with relief when the sacred function was finally over, and the nurse had entered her carriage with her bawling charge. To Alraune, as the Alraune, as the professor called her, out of a very understandable whim, Nothing noteworthy seems to have happened in the first few years of her life. At any rate, the leather-bound volume contains little worth quoting outside of a note to the effect that the professor carried out a resolution he had made even before Alraune's appearance into this world. He adopted the girl and had a legally certified will drawn up making her his sole heir to the exclusion of all his relatives. There is a mention, too, of a present sent by the Duchess as a gift to her godchild, an extremely expensive and elaborate ugly necklace consisting of 4 diamond set gold chains and 2 strings of pearls. All this, however, was just the setting for a strand of red hair, likewise richly adorned with pearls, which formed the centerpiece of this remarkable objet d'art. I don't know how to say that. This the Duchess had ordered, made from a lock of hair which she had cut from the head of the unconscious mother at the time of the conception of the child. Hello, bruvs. This is Alraune by Heinz Ewers. Alraune remained in the clinic more than 4 years, that is, until the Privy Councillor gave up the institute together with its experimental laboratories, which he had anyhow been neglecting more and more of late. He and his little adopted girl then removed to the estate at Lendennick. Here Wolfchen Gontram, the youngest son of the king's council, despite his 4 years of seniority, became Alraune's playmate. Privy Councillor Ten Brinken wasted few words on the collapse of the house of Gontram. In a couple of short sentences, he describes how Death finally grew tired of playing around with the inmates of the White House on the Rhine, and in 1 year wiped out the mother and 3 sons. The Right Reverend Chaplain Schroeder took Joseph, the 4th son, whose mother had wished him to become an ecclesiastic. The daughter Frida went to Rome to live with her friend Olga Wolkonsky, who had, in the meanwhile, married a somewhat dubious Spanish count. The financial collapse of the king's council occurred at the very same time, despite the handsome fee he received from the Duchess for finally bringing her matrimonial lawsuit to a successful conclusion. The Privy Councillor presents his taking of the youngest child as a kind of philanthropic act, but does not forget to add that Wolfchen had inherited some vineyards and small houses from an aunt on his mother's side, so that his future was thus secure. He remarks, too, that he had requested the senior Gontram to transfer the administration of this property to himself, and then he states further that out of delicacy for the lad's feelings, not for a moment would he want little Gontram to grow up with the wretched idea of having been brought up by strangers. Out of charity, he employed the resulting income to defray the boy's upkeep. One may readily imagine that the councillor did not suffer any great loss in this affair. Moreover, the entries which Privy Councillor Ten Brinken made into the leather-bound volume during these years allow one to conclude that Wolfchen richly deserved the bread he ate at Lendennick. He not only made a good playmate for his little foster sister, he was in fact more than that. He was her sole toy and her nursemaid, all in one. Though he had been accustomed to knock around with his wild brothers, his love went out at once to this delicate little creature who ran around all alone in the big garden, in the stables, the greenhouses, and the other buildings. All the deaths in the house of his parents and the sudden collapse of all his little world had made a deep impression on him, in spite of his inborn sloth. The handsome little fellow with the big dreamy eyes of his mother suddenly grew quiet and thoughtful. When the thousands of boyish matters in which his whole being had been wrapped up had ceased to be, all his repressed emotions went out to the little girl, Alraune, and fastened themselves there like ivy with many thin rootlets. Whatever his young breast had contained of love and loyalty, he gave to her with the unlimited kindness that he had inherited from his sunnily disposed parents. At noon, when he came back from school, ravenously hungry, he ran past the kitchen and hunted around in the garden until he had found Alraune. The servants often had to drag him in by force in order to give him his meals. No one really looked after the two children, but whereas they regarded the little girl with a strange suspicion, they all took a sort of liking to Wolfchen. Thus, the rather clumsy love of the servants which they had formerly bestowed upon Frank Braun, the master's nephew, who used to spend his vacations here, they now showered on Gontram's little boy. Hello, Robs. And just as Freudsheim, the coachman, had once liked to have Frank about, so now he looked for Wolfchen, picked the lad up and put him on the horses, let him ride, seated on the blanket, through the court and down the driveway. The gardener showed him where to get the best fruits and where to cut the most flexible switches, while the maids kept his food warm and saw to it that he lacked for nothing. They liked the way he understood how to make them all feel as though they were on an equal footing with him, whereas the girl, as small as she was, had a peculiar way of emphasizing the broad moat between them. She never chatted with them. In fact, she never spoke to them at all, unless it was to express a wish, and then her tones suggested a command rather than a desire. And that was exactly what the soul of these Rhenish people couldn't bear, not even from their own master, to say nothing of this strange child. They never struck her. The privy councillor had forbidden it most stringently, but in every other way they made it very apparent that they didn't intend to bother about her, and they acted as if she didn't exist. She ran about the grounds. Well, they had to let her run, and of course they had to take care of her food and her little bed, her underwear and her clothes, but they performed all this with the grace that they brought to their task. When they fed the nasty-tempered watchdog in the court, when they swept out his kennel or unchained him at night. As for the privy councillor, he took absolutely no notice of the children. He let them do just as they pleased. Shortly after giving up his clinic, he had also resigned his professorship, and from then on occupied himself only with his old love, archaeology, in addition, to be sure, to all sorts of real estate and mortgage affairs. He even brought his clever business mind to bear upon his archaeology, and he understood how to sell his skillfully arranged collections to museums all over the world, and for high prices, too. The ground all around the Ten Brinken estate, up to the Rhine and the city on one side, and far out to the Eiffel promontory on the other, was simply full of things that the Romans and their auxiliaries had brought with them. The Ten Brinkens had long been collectors, and if a farmer anywhere within 10 miles struck his plow against something, then he dug it up carefully and brought his treasure to Lendennick, to the old house sacred to John of Nepomuk. The professor took everything: pots full of coins, rusty weapons, and yellowed bones, urns, buckles, and tear vials. He paid in pennies at the most, but in return the farmer was always sure of a good glass of whiskey in the kitchen, and if he was short, he could always be certain of getting the money needed for sowing, with a high rate of interest, true, but without the security demanded by the banks. And this was certain: never before had this area of ground spewed up so many treasures as in the years since Alraune had come to stay with the privy councillor. The professor said to himself, "She brings gold into the house," and he laughed. He realized, of course, that these things happened in the most natural manner as a result of the fact that he now occupied himself with these matters more intensively than ever before. But he intentionally allowed himself to play with the idea that there was some connection. He embarked in quite daring speculations, bought large parcels of real estate along the projected continuation of the broad suburban avenue, had the earth dug up and every handful searched. He did business and affairs involving great risks, For example, he put the mortgage bank on a sound basis when every sensible person was predicting that it would go bankrupt within a very short time. Then, by chance, an acidulated spring of carbonated water was discovered on one of his properties. He ordered it barreled and bottled. Thus it was that he entered the water business. He began to buy up all the springs he could find in the Rhenish region and soon monopolized this industry. He created a little trust and draped it with the national flag, explaining that it was necessary to take a stand against the foreign exploiters, particularly the English who owned Apollinaris. The small owners flocked to this new leader, swore by his excellency, and were quite willing that he should reserve a large block of shares for himself when the stock company was formed, and they acted intelligently, for the privy councillor doubled their dividends and dealt harshly with those who had remained outside, refusing to join. He pursued a great number of things at one time, all different, but for one characteristic, they invariably had something to do with the ground. It was just a whim, a conscious play of an idea on an idea. Alraune draws gold out of the ground, he thought, and stuck to business connected with Mother Earth. He himself didn't believe in it, no, not for a single moment, and yet in his wildest speculations he had perfect confidence that as long as they pertained to the earth, he was bound to succeed. He refused to participate in anything else, would not even look into it, no matter what it might be. For instance, extremely profitable investments in stocks that were absolutely certain to rise and involved not the slightest risk. Instead, he bought up great amounts of extremely risky mine shares and coal and metallurgical stocks and became interested in a whole series of quite shady mining concerns, and he always won. Alraune does it, he said, and laughed. There came a day when this thought became more than a joke. Wolfchen was digging in the garden behind the stables, underneath the big mulberry tree. It was there that Alraune had decided she would have her subterranean castle. Day after day he dug. Once in a while one of the gardener's boys helped him. The little girl sat near by and neither spoke nor smiled, but only looked on silently. And then one evening the little fellow's spade struck something that resounded like metal. The gardener's boy helped him, and the two of them, with their fingers, dug out the brown earth very carefully from between the roots, and they brought the professor a sword belt, a buckle, and a handful of coins. Now he had the place thoroughly dug up and searched in a very methodical way, and reaped a small treasure trove, all genuine Gallic pieces, very rare and fetching high prices. Of course, there was nothing supernatural in such a find. The peasants all about him frequently found things. Why then should not his own garden have contained a cache? But the point was this. Why, he asked the boy, had he dug in that particular spot beneath the mulberry tree? And Wolfchen answered that Alraune had insisted that he dig there and nowhere else. He questioned Alraune too, but Alraune would not answer. She is a divining rod, the privy councillor thought. She can feel where the earth conceals its treasures. He laughed at the very idea. Yes, he still laughed. Occasionally he took her along with him towards the Rhine, where his men were digging on his property near the suburban highway. Suddenly he asked her dryly, "Where shall the men dig?" And he would watch her sharply when she walked across the fields, to see if her delicate body gave a sign which might indicate. But she did not answer, and her body gave no sign. Later, however, she understood what was wanted of her, perhaps too well. Sometimes she would stand still, wherever she might be, and she would say, "Dig." The men dug, but nothing was found. Then she would burst into laughter. The professor would say to himself, "She's making sport of us." Nevertheless, he always gave orders to dig according to her indications. Once or twice they did find something, a human grave, and again a great urn brimful of early silver pieces. Now the privy councillor said, "It's a coincidence," but what he thought was, "It may be a coincidence." One afternoon, when the privy councillor came out of his library, he saw young Wolfchen standing half naked near the pump, stretching his bare torso forward. The old coachman was pumping a stream of cold water on his head, neck, back, and arms. The boy's skin was flaming red and showed tiny blisters everywhere. "What's the matter with you, Wolfchen?" he asked. The lad clenched his teeth and would not answer. Great tears welled up out of his deep black eyes. But the coachman said, "It comes from stinging nettles. The little girl beat him with nettles." But Wolfchen defended himself. "No, no," he cried. "She didn't hit me. It's all my own fault. I threw myself into them." The privy councillor cross-examined him. It proved to be quite a task to draw the truth from him, and only with the coachman's help was it possible to extract a connected story. It seems that he undressed himself down to his hips and threw himself into the patch of stinging nettles and rolled around in it. So far he had told the truth, but the reason he had done so was because his little sister had asked him to. She had noticed how his hand had become red and inflamed when he had happened to touch the poisonous herb. Thereupon she had induced him to stick his other hand into the prickly leaves and finally to undress and wallow among them with his naked breast. "You crazy fool," the counselor scolded him. Then he asked whether Alraune had also touched the nettles. "Oh, yes," said the boy, "but she didn't burn herself." The professor went into the garden and hunted about until he found his foster child. She was at the further end, behind the big wall, tearing up great bunches of stinging nettles from where they grew on a heap of rubbish. Upon her thin, naked arm she carried these to the glycinia arbor across the way, where she strewed them upon the ground. She was preparing a regular couch. "For whom is that?" he asked. The little child looked up at him and then said seriously, "For Wolfchen." He examined her hands and her thin little arms. There was not the slightest sign of any rash. "Come with me," he said. He led her to the greenhouse where Japanese primroses grew in long rows. "Break off the flowers," he commanded, and Alraune picked blossom after blossom. She had to stretch herself and reach up high, and thus brought her arms everywhere in contact with the poisonous leaves, but not a trace of any eruption appeared. "She is evidently immune," the professor murmured. In the brown leather-bound volume is still to be found the professor's elegant dissertation on the occurrence of urticaria as a result of contact with Urtica, Dioicia, and Primula obconica. Therein he sets forth that the action is a purely chemical one, that the little hairs on the stems and leaves not only wound the skin, but also sweat out an acid which sets up a local reaction. He attempted to discover whether and to what extent this very rare immunity is related to the insensibility of witches and maniacs, and whether or not the cause of this phenomenon was to be searched for in an autosuggestion of hysterical origin. Now that he had begun to find something strange in the little girl, he sought conscientiously for anything that seemed to point to the supernatural. An addendum here remarks that the actual birth of the child took place at midnight. This was something that Dr. Peterson had not thought of sufficient importance to mention. Alraune, the professor concludes, was thus brought into this world in the most time-honored and correct fashion. Old Brombach had come down from the hill country 4 hours beyond the village of Philippe. Or is that Philip? I'll say Philippe. He was a semi-invalid who eked out a miserable existence by tramping through the hamlets of the promontory, selling tickets to church lotteries, likewise holy images and rosaries. He hobbled into the courtyard and had the servant convey to the privy councillor the news that he had brought along some Roman things which a farmer had found in the field. The servant returned, saying that the professor was too busy just at present. Brombach must wait. So the peddler waited, seated himself on the stone bench in the court, and smoked his pipe. 2 hours later, the privy councillor called him in. He always made people wait, even when he was at leisure. Nothing, he used to say, brought pieces down so quickly as making people wait. This time, however, he really had been busy. The director of the Germanic Museum of Nuremberg was with him, having just purchased an exceedingly neat collection of Gallic finds in the Rhineland. Of course, the counselor did not let Brambeck into the library. He stopped him in the little vestibule and cried, "Now, you old rascal, let's see what you've got there." The cripple untied his immense red handkerchief and carefully deposited its contents on a rickety cane chair. There were a large number of coins, a few fragments of a helmet, the pommel of a shield, and an exquisite tear vial. The privy councillor scarcely gave a look at the collection, but his eye had not failed to notice the little vial. "Is that all, Brambuck?" he asked reproachfully, and when the old man nodded, the professor began at once to upbraid him violently. As old as the hills, but still as dumb as a ragamuffin. He had wasted 4 hours to come here, and it would take him 4 hours to get back, and he had had to wait a few hours in addition. That's the way he dawdled away the blessed day, just for this little bit of trash. The whole business wasn't worth a damn. He'd better just pack it all up again and get out, because he wasn't going to get a red cent for it. How often had he repeated it, over and over again? Those ignorant farmers simply couldn't get it into their noodles that they weren't to run straight to Lendennick every time they found some piece of junk. Let them wait patiently until they had collected something worth looking at. But perhaps he enjoyed hobbling along on his crooked leg 4 hours here and 4 hours back in the hot sun. He ought to be ashamed of himself. Bramback alternately scratched his head and twisted his brown cap. He wanted to say something to alter the professor's moods, but he who was generally so fluently able to talk up his wares was now too embarrassed to utter a single word. He could think of nothing but the long way he had traveled, and it was exactly for that. He was being reproached. He was completely crushed, filled only with the shame of his stupidity. He did not say a word until the professor paused, and then he begged to be allowed at least to leave the things here, so that he shouldn't have to drag them all the way back. The counselor nodded generously and even gave him a half mark. "Here you are, Brambeck, for the journey, but use a little sense next time and remember what I told you. And now go into the kitchen and get yourself a slice of bread and butter and a glass of beer." The crippled veteran thanked him and, more than glad to have escaped so cheaply, hobbled across the court towards the kitchen. No sooner had he disappeared than His Excellency Ten Brinken snatched up the tear vial. He drew a silk handkerchief from his pocket and carefully cleaned the precious object, turning it about in the light in order to admire it from all sides. Then he opened the door and re-entered the library where the curator from Nuremberg stood before a glass case. He flourished the vial in his extended hand. "Here, my dear doctor, look at this," he began. "Here I have still a most unusual treasure that I want you to look at. It, too, belongs to Tullia's grave. You know, the sister of General Aulus, who had his encampment at Schwarzrhein. I showed you just a moment ago the other discoveries made at that place." He handed the vial to the doctor and continued, "Now tell me what you would judge to be its place of origin." The curator took the glass and approached the window and adjusted his glasses. He begged for a lens and a piece of silk, wiped and rubbed the surface, and held it in the light, revolving it this way and that. Finally, he said, and hesitated as though he were not quite certain of himself. "It seems to be of Syrian make, probably from the glass factory at Palmyra." "Bravo!" cried the privy councillor. "Hereafter I shall have to be on my guard against you. You're certainly an expert." If the curator had chosen to say Agrigentum or Munda, the professor would have acknowledged it with equal enthusiasm. "And now, doctor, what about the period?" The curator regarded the vial once again. "Second century," he replied. "First half." And now his voice was full of assurance. "My compliments," the privy councillor corroborated. "I know of no one who would have made a more quick and accurate determination." "Aside from yourself, of course," the flattered savant replied. But the professor declared modestly, "You greatly overestimate my learning, dear doctor. I required no less than 8 days of severe labor in order to fix with certainty the date and origin of this vial. You can't imagine the number of volumes I had to go through. Well, I'm sorry, it is certainly a rarely beautiful piece. Cost me enough to. The fellow who found it struck it lucky." "I should like to have it for my museum," the director declared. "What are you asking for it?" "For Nuremberg? Only 5,000 marks," the professor replied. "You know that I have special prices for all the German museums. Next week, 2 gentlemen from London are to be here. Then I shall ask for 8,000 and surely get it." "But, Your Excellency," the curator countered, 5,000 marks? You know that I can't pay out any such sum. That exceeds my authority." The privy councillor said, "I'm really very sorry, but I can't part with the vial for less." The Nuremberger carefully considered the little flask. "It is a delightful tear vial. I am quite smitten with it. I'll give you 3,000, Your Excellency." "No, not a penny less than 5,000, the counselor insisted. "But I'll tell you what I'll do, since it pleases you so much, doctor. Allow me to present it to you personally as a slight gift. Keep it as a memento of your accurate determination." "Thanks, Your Excellency, many thanks," the curator cried. He rose and shook the counselor's hand, "but my position will not allow me to accept any presents. Forgive me, then, if I must decline. Besides, I have decided to pay your price. We must on no account permit this piece to go to England. It must remain in our fatherland." He went over to the desk and wrote out his check. Before he had left, the privy councillor had talked him into buying the other less interesting pieces, also out of the grave of Tulia, the sister of General Aulus. The professor ordered the carriage out and accompanied his visitor to the gate. When he returned across the court, he observed Wolfchen and Alraune standing with the peddler, who was showing them his gaily colored images of saints. Old Brombach's courage had revived a bit, due to the food and drink. Moreover, he had sold the cook a rosary, a special one that he claimed had been blessed by the bishop, and was therefore worth 30 pfennigs more than the others. All this had reactivated his tongue, which a while ago had been so timid. He steeled his heart and limped over to the counselor. "Professor," he pleaded, "buy the children a pretty image of St. Joseph." His Excellency, Ten Brinken, was in a good mood. "St. Joseph?" he queried. "No, but perhaps you have a John of Nepomuk." No, he didn't. He had a St. Anthony, however, and a John, a Thomas, and a Jacob, but unfortunately he had no Nepomuk. So poor Brombach had to listen again while the counselor accused him of not understanding his business. In London, Nick, one couldn't expect to sell anything but St. Nepomuk. The peddler, crushed again, made nevertheless one last attempt. "A lottery ticket, then. Take a chance. It's for the restoration of the church of St. Lawrence in Dolmen. It costs only 1 mark, and every buyer receives an indulgence of 100 days in purgatory. See, here it is in print," and he held the ticket up to the professor's face. "No," the latter said, "we have no use for indulgences. We are of the company of the Jew, I don't know what that is, and we'll go to heaven anyhow, and one can't ever win anything in a lottery." "Is that so?" the peddler replied. "You can't win? Why, there are 300 prizes, and the first amounts to 50,000 marks in cash. Here, you can read it for yourself." And he pointed out the precise spot with his dirty finger. The professor took the ticket. "You jackass," he laughed. "And here it says 500,000 tickets. Now you can figure out what chance one has of winning." He turned to go, but the cripple hobbled after him, holding on to his coat. "Aw, take a chance anyhow," he begged. "We poor fellows have to make a living too." "No," exclaimed the professor, but the peddler was not to be discouraged. "I have a suspicion that you're going to win." "You people are always full of such suspicions," said the counselor. "Let the little one pick out a number. That brings luck." Brombach insisted. The professor stopped suddenly and hesitated. "I'll try it," he murmured. "Come here, Alraune," he cried. "Draw a ticket." The child came tripping up. The cripple made a fan of his tickets and held them towards her. "Close your eyes," he ordered. "That's right. Now pick." Alraune drew a ticket and gave it to the counselor. The latter hesitated a moment and then beckoned to the lad. You draw one too, Wolfchen, he said. In the leather-bound volume, His Excellency Ten Brinken reports that he won 50,000 marks in the Dolmen Church lottery. Unfortunately, he adds, it was not possible to determine whether the winning number was the one drawn by Alraune or the one picked by Wolfchen, for he had put them both together into the drawer of his desk and had neglected to write the children's names on them. But as for himself, he had absolutely no doubt that it was Alraune who had picked the lucky number. The Privy Councillor does not fail to mention how he demonstrated his gratitude to old Brombach, who had forced this money onto the councillor. He made the fellow a present of 5 marks and used his influence to see to it that the local fund for the relief and assistance of aged and disabled veterans should send Brombach a yearly remittance of 30 marks. And that's the end of chapter 6. There's chapter 7 with some kind of demon. I assume that's Alraune. Alraune. And that might be Satan. I don't know who it is, but that's what awaits next time. Next time on Masterpiece Theater. All right, Brobs, that's all. What did anyone say here? Baby, you're not very good at reading. Yes, he is. These are like German words and shit. Oh, yes, baby, read me that book. For reading, which book, chat? What book, chat? Blah, blah, blah. All right, you dumb motherfuckers. Anyone got anything to say before I shut this stream down? How far am I into this book? 140 pages. I think there's 340. So about less than halfway. Anybody? 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 I guess that's a no. All right, Brobs. Goodbye.